Hello, welcome to the first, or I guess the second lecture, if you count the day that we went over the course outline, of Phil 1700, Philosophy of Love and Sex. Now, if you look at the course outline, which hopefully you have, because I assume we went over it, you'll see that the course is divided into two units. About half the course, so 8 lectures or so, 9 lectures or so, is devoted to the philosophy of love. And then the other half of the course is devoted to the philosophy of sex. Today, we start our first unit. So we're starting that first unit on the philosophy of love, which is going to occupy us for about half the class. And what I'm going to do is introduce that unit. So I'm going to introduce, basically, in a nutshell, the philosophy of love. What it is, what we're going to do for these next 9 lectures or so. Now, if you look at the course outline, again, you'll see that the reading for today is Alan Sobel's An Introduction to the Philosophy of Love. And so that's what I'm going to be using. I'm not going to be referring to page numbers. I'm not going to be quoting Sobel because it's a general introduction that I'm using to introduce you to some key concepts. What I will do, though, is point to a few key questions and key concepts that Sobel touches on in his reading. So by now, I'm expecting that you've read it. And what I'm going to do is to kind of pick out some important tidbits to help guide you, so to help kind of lay the groundwork for what's coming for the next 9 lectures or so. So here is what I want to do for today. I've divided the class into two halves. In the first place, I want us to talk about the philosophy of love. I'm going to start by talking about what philosophy is, because I'm not assuming that anybody's taken philosophy before. This is a first-year class. Many of you presumably are in your first year and might just not have much of an idea of what philosophy is. And then I'm going to talk about the concept of love. And here's where I'm going to draw on Sobel to give you some concepts and to give you some ideas of the kinds of questions that we're going to be talking about for the remainder of this class. Then, in the second half of the class, we're going to talk about the history of the philosophy of love. This is a history of philosophy class. And we're not doing contemporary philosophy in this class. We're not looking at philosophy that's being written now. We're looking at the history of philosophy. We're looking at philosophy written basically from 2,400 years ago until about 60-ish years ago. So this is a history of philosophy class. So it'll be useful to give you a timeline of Western philosophy, because what we're looking at in this class is the history of Western philosophy, to kind of situate you, give you some historical context for what's going to be coming up in the next 8 or 9 weeks, and actually over the course of the entire semester. And then I'm going to finish by talking about 3 concepts of love that have been important over the history of the philosophy of love, and that you'll see recurring over and over again over the course of this unit. And if you've read the Sobel reading, you'll see that he talks about all of these. So again, the point of this is to give you kind of the lay of the land, to set up everything we're going to need in order to talk about the big figures in the history of Western philosophy who have said something to us about love, notably in this case, Plato, Aristotle, and Aquinas. That's who we're going to be reading for the next few weeks. Okay, so first, let's start with the philosophy of love. So again, I want to talk about what philosophy is, and I want to talk about specifically what the philosophy of love is. So first things first, what is philosophy? Now, etymologically, you might know already that philosophy means the love of wisdom. Etymology, in case you don't know, is simply the study of the origin of words. Okay, so what I'm saying when I say that etymologically means this, is that if you look at the origin of the word, you see that it referred to, or it's made up of parts that indicate something like the love of wisdom. Okay, so it comes from the ancient Greek philia, which, as we'll see within an hour or so, is one of the concepts of love that you find in ancient Greek, or to put it differently, it's one of the ancient Greek words for love, and the ancient Greek word Sophia, which is the word for wisdom. Okay, so or etymologically, philosophy means the philia of Sophia, right? The love of wisdom, or to put it differently, the love of knowledge or the love of learning. So historically speaking, the word philosopher was used to refer to anyone who was involved in pursuing knowledge or wisdom or learning, right? So the word philosophy originally was much broader. It basically referred to what we would now call academia. Okay. So if you read the Greek philosophers, like if you read Aristotle, for example, we call Aristotle a philosopher. And he did have books on things that we now think of as being part of philosophy. But he also had books on things that we would now no longer think of as being part of philosophy. So if you read Aristotle's De Anima, that's basically a work of early psychology. If you read his physics, well, that's basically a work of early physics. His movement of animals, that's a work of early biology, and so on and so forth. His poetics is basically literary criticism. Okay. But at the time, all this was considered to be philosophy. Why? Well, all of it is learning. All of it is love of wisdom or learning or knowledge. Okay. So that's the etymological sense of the term. That's where the term philosophy comes from. Um, but as for what it means now, this is a different question. Um, in a contemporary setting, so when we talk about philosophy now, what we're talking about is you could call it, this is like a textbook definition, the study of fundamental questions pertaining to existence, knowledge, and value. Okay, and actually you could throw in existence, knowledge, value, and reason in there. Okay, so that's the contemporary definition. That's the textbook definition that you might find in an introduction to philosophy, which this is basically. So again, etymologically, it meant one thing, the love of wisdom. And that's important for us, by the way. You'll see that Plato plays a lot on this idea that philosophy is a kind of love, right? That it's a philia. But that's the etymological sense. In contemporary settings, when you're doing philosophy now, when you talk about philosophy now, you're talking about this. The study of this. This is like a textbook definition. It's a little bit simplified, but broadly speaking, you can say that philosophy is the study of these things: existence, knowledge, value, and wisdom. Oh, sorry, and reason. Now, that might sound a little vague, right? What is it to study existence? What is it to study value? I would like to be clear, though, that what I mean here is something quite precise. And we can see what exactly we're talking about, what exactly philosophy consists in, by considering some of its subfields. Okay, so some of the subdisciplines of the discipline that is philosophy. So here on this slide, I'm going to have some subfields that I want to explain briefly, just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that philosophers do, the kinds of questions that philosophers are asking about. So one subdiscipline of philosophy is what's called metaphysics. Okay. Remember in my definition on the last slide, I had three areas, right? I said that philosophy is the study of existence, knowledge, and value. Each of these maps onto a subdiscipline more or less. So the existence there, the study of existence is metaphysics. It's the study of reality, right? The way that I like to explain this to students to make it simple, to make it clear, is to say that it's the study of what there is and what it's like, right? Of what exists and what it's like. So for example, here are some classic metaphysical questions. Is there a God? Is there a soul? Is there free will? Is there a self? Is there such a thing as a self that remains the same from one moment to another or not? Right? These are all metaphysical questions. They're questions about what is, about what kinds of things are, right? What exists. We can also ask metaphysical questions about what things are like, right? So suppose that we think there is a God. Okay, what's he like? Is he all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, or is he limited in some way? Suppose that we think there's a soul. Okay, is it immortal? Is it simple or complex? Suppose that we think that there's free will. Suppose that we think that there's a self. What are these things like? Okay, so these are examples of metaphysical questions. It's worth pointing out that metaphysical questions often have the form, what is X, right? What is this thing? Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates, notoriously used to go around the market in Athens asking people, pestering people by asking them questions like, what is X, right? What is virtue? What is justice? What is goodness? Do you even know? Okay, so these are the kinds of things, these are the kinds of questions that fall under metaphysics, right? So if people are there saying, or talking about the soul, or talking about God, or talking about free will, or talking about the self, and I go, well, wait a minute, what is the soul? What is that thing? What is free will? What is the self? These are metaphysical questions. They're questions about what is, what there is, and what it's like. Okay, that thing, the soul, what is it like? What are you talking about? That thing, free will, what is it like? What are you talking about? Okay, so that's one subdiscipline of philosophy, metaphysics. The second subdiscipline of philosophy corresponds to the second term in my definition, right? So I said philosophy is the study of existence, knowledge, value. So here's the knowledge component. Another subdiscipline of philosophy is what's called epistemology. Okay? Epistemology is the study of knowledge. So it's the study of what we know, what kinds of things we know, what kinds of things we can know, how we know the kinds of things that we know, and where that knowledge comes from. Right. So here on the slide, I've got the scope of knowledge. Right. What kinds of things is it possible for us to know about? So earlier I was talking about things like God and the soul. These are supernatural entities. Okay. Is it possible for us to know about supernatural entities? And if so, how? This is related to the sources of knowledge. Where does knowledge come from? Does it come just from the senses? Like, do we only come to know things by seeing them, hearing them, smelling them, touching them, tasting them? Or are we able to know some things through reason alone? So, for example, we all know, well, I know, I hope you know too, that the square root of 9 is 3. Okay, how do we know that? I've never observed that with my senses. So is that the kind of thing that we know through reason alone? And if so, what other kinds of things can we know through reason alone? Right? So these are questions about the scope of knowledge, the kinds of things that we can know about, and the sources of knowledge, where knowledge comes from, the senses, reason, etc. Epistemology also handles belief, right? We believe all kinds of things. We think all kinds of things are true. I believe that there's coffee in this cup, that there are books behind me, that I'm wearing a red shirt, and so on and so forth. What makes those beliefs justified? Right? So we can ask what makes those beliefs knowledge, right? So not only do I believe there's coffee in this cup, I would say that I know there's coffee in this cup. We can also talk about what makes a belief justified. So even if I don't know something, what makes me justified in believing it? Okay, so that's epistemology. All right. And the third big subdiscipline of philosophy that I want to draw your attention to is ethics. Okay, so again, to go back to my definition, I said that philosophy is the study of existence, knowledge, value. This is the value component. Ethics, to put it maybe a little bit too simply, is the study of value. Okay, so it's the study of goodness, badness, rightness, wrongness, of what is good, bad, right, wrong, of what we should or shouldn't do or ought not to do. That's what ethics is. In ethics, we ask questions like, what kinds of things are good and bad? What kinds of actions ought we to perform? And especially, why? Right? Why are some things good and bad? What does it mean for them to be good and bad? And why are some things right or wrong? What does it mean for them to be right or wrong? Okay. Now, there are other subdisciplines of philosophy. I did mention that this is a somewhat simplified definition. This is how complicated philosophy can get, okay? There is a subdiscipline of philosophy called metaphilosophy, where people ask questions about what philosophy is and how to do philosophy, right? How we're supposed to do philosophy, how it works exactly, what its methods are. So it can get a lot more complicated than this. And you could throw in, earlier I said you could add reason to the list of things that philosophy studies. You could add in logic as a subdiscipline of philosophy. Logic is one of the most important subdisciplines of philosophy. But anyway, this is a simplified portrait of what philosophy does that will help guide you in this course, I hope. Now, maybe I'll take a moment to dispel a misunderstanding, talk about the methods of philosophy, because a lot of people, unfortunately, view philosophy as something that's very vague, something that's poetic, hazy, that's kind of mysterious. Okay, when I took philosophy in my first year, this is forever ago, this is 2008. When I took philosophy at Carleton University in 2008 with Professor Heidi Maybaum, who's no longer there, she was doing what I'm doing for you now, which is explaining what philosophy is. And she was talking about how important it is in philosophy to be clear and to be precise and to argue carefully. And one student raised his hand and he said, well, like if it's philosophy, like doesn't it have to be kind of mysterious or kind of difficult to understand, like, isn't that kind of what philosophy is about? And I can still see her, I can still picture her doing this. She just kind of took a step back and she went, no. And that was the end of that discussion. um, and here I'm afraid I must take her side. No, philosophy should not be vague or hazy or difficult to understand. Um, that is a completely inaccurate understanding of what philosophers do. On the contrary, in philosophy, we emphasize clarity, logical rigor, precision. Okay. Now, and I should say, and that's the way it's been since day one. Like when you read ancient philosophers, they're also all about the clarity and the precision and the rigor. Now, admittedly, some philosophers are quite vague, quite hard to understand, not very clear. But that they're just doing it not very well, right? That's not what we're aiming at. And while it's true that there is some very bad philosophy that is very unclear, what we would like to do, certainly in this class, and certainly most of us, is be good philosophers. And that means, again, being very clear, being very precise, and making sure that our arguments are as logically rigorous as possible. Okay, now I've got these three subfields of philosophy in front of us. And I just want to point out that in this class, we're mostly going to be dealing with two of them. Okay, we're not really doing any epistemology in this class. We're not doing any theory of knowledge. We're not going to be asking anything about that. The two main subfields of philosophy that we are going to be interested in are metaphysics and ethics. Okay, we're going to be asking questions about what certain things are like. And we're going to be asking questions about what is good and bad, better or worse, right or wrong. Okay, for the entire course. So this is true for this first unit on the philosophy of love. But as you'll see, it's also going to be true for our second unit, which is going to be on the philosophy of sex. In both units, we're going to be asking two kinds of questions. First, metaphysical questions, and second, ethical questions. Okay, and in what follows, I'm going to explain exactly what those kinds of questions or what those questions are going to be. Okay, so that's kind of like the broad general introduction to philosophy, giving you a sense of what philosophy is, what it's interested in, and how it does what it does. Okay, now let's turn more specifically to the philosophy of love, and to the Sobel reading. Okay, so here's where I'm going to start to draw on the Sobel reading that I hope you've read. It's a good thing to do when you're doing philosophy to start to be clear about the concept you're talking about. Now, in everyday life, we talk about love, right? We have a concept of love. We say we love all kinds of things. So here are some examples, right? We do have a concept of love in everyday life. And we might say that we have love for our romantic partner, right? You might say to your boyfriend or girlfriend, I love you. We might say that we have love for our family or our friends, right? You might tell your mother or your father or your sister or your cousin or whatever, I love you. Sometimes we might even say that we love humanity as a whole. In certain philosophical traditions, notably the Christian tradition, you are supposed to have universal love, unconditional love for all human beings, right? So a Christian might say, and maybe some non-Christians as well, that they love all human beings. You might say that you love your country or your religion or your ideal, or some ideals rather, right? You can love Canada or the United States or whatever. You can also love ideals like justice or virtue or even knowledge, right? You say that you love foods, activities, and artwork. You might say that you love pad thai, or that you love going to the cinema, or that you love Star Trek, which I do. You might say that you love inanimate objects, right? You might say that you love a painting, something like this, but also a memento, something that's important to you, or just some item, a gift that you got, something like this. So the philosophical question here, if we start from this concept, is okay, well, what are we talking about, right? You're talking about love. What is that? What is the thing that you're claiming to have for all of these things? What is the thing the emotion, the relation, whatever it is that you're claiming to have to your romantic partner when you say that you love them, your friends and family when you say that you love them, to humanity when you say that you love it, to your country, religion, ideal, favorite foods, favorite activities, favorite artwork, favorite inanimate objects. What is it that you're claiming to have? What is love? Okay. The answer to which, of course, is baby, don't hurt me no more. If you don't get that reference, please email me and I will fix that for you. So you see that this question, what is love, is a metaphysical question, right? What is that thing that you're talking about? And what is it like? Right? What is love like? What are its characteristics or its properties or its traits? These are all three words that mean the same thing and that I'm going to use interchangeably. What are the traits or the characteristics or the properties of love? Um, Now, if we're going to talk about this, which we are for the next 9 lectures or so, um, it'll be useful to us to have a kind of conceptual schema for talking about it. Okay, to have some terminology and some concepts in place for talking about these metaphysical questions about love. So I'm going to introduce that now. Um, let's take one of these sentences, right? Like, I love this person, my romantic partner, or I love humanity as a whole, whatever. Let's take the sentence, Rachel loves Ross. Here's another thing. Uh, I hope you get this reference. If you don't get this reference because you don't watch Friends, then I don't know what you're doing here. Please turn off this lecture and go watch Friends and then come back. But let's take this sentence. This person on the left here is Rachel. She's a character on the TV show Friends. This person on the right is Ross, who is also a character on the TV show Friends. Now, suppose that I say, Rachel loves Ross. Now, in this scenario, the person who loves is Rachel. Right? Rachel is the person who loves. She loves Ross. The person who loves, or the person who experiences the love, we're going to call the subject of love. Okay? Or you'll also see this term, the lover. Okay? I think Sobel uses this term a bit. When you read Plato for the next lecture, you'll see that people talk about the lover. They mean the subject of love, the person who experiences the love, the person who has the love. Okay? We can then distinguish between the subject and what we're going to call the object of love. Okay, the object of love is going to be the person who is loved, right? It's the person who receives the love, or maybe to put it maybe more precisely, the person at whom the love is directed. Okay, so another term for this, which you're going to see a bunch over the next few weeks, is the beloved. Okay, so the object of love you can also call the beloved, whether the object is a person or a thing. You'll see when you read the Plato again that there's this language of the lover loving the beloved, right? So the lover is the one who loves, the subject of love. The beloved is the one who is loved, the object of love. Now, whenever I present this, I'll have some students ask me, well, wait a minute, why are you calling, in this case, Ross, an object, right? Can a person be an object? And the answer to that is, well, it depends on what you mean by an object. Sometimes in everyday life, we use the word object to mean an inanimate thing, right? In that sense of the term, this pencil is an object, each of these books behind me is an object, this cup's an object, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously, in that sense, Ross is not an object, right? Ross is not an inanimate thing. But there's another sense of object too. Think about when you're learning grammar, right? When you learn grammar, you talk about the subject of a sentence and the object of a sentence. So in the sentence, Ross loves Rachel, or Rachel loves Ross, sorry. Rachel is the grammatical subject because she's the one performing the action of loving. Whereas Ross is the grammatical object, right? He's the one receiving the action of loving. He's the one at whom the action is directed, the verb is directed. Similarly, if I say, I am running outside, I am the subject, and outside is the object, right? It is the thing receiving the action. In that sense, Ross is the object, right? That is closer to the sense of object that I'm using. So the subject of some action, or in this case of some experience or emotion, is the one who has the experience or the emotion, or who performs the action. The object is the one who receives the action, or who is what that action or emotion or experience is directed at. Okay? So that's some language we're going to be using. The subject of love, the object of love. I want to introduce one other term. Suppose that I say that Rachel loves Ross because he's smart and funny and kind. Okay. Now these are the reasons for her love, right? And our terminology for that, our term for that is going to be that these are the bases of love. Bases here is just the plural of basis, right? So if you read the Sobel reading, he talks about the basis of love. So we can distinguish between the subject of love, who is the one who experiences the love, the one who loves, the object of love, who is the one who is at whom the love is directed, um, who receives the love, the one who is loved. And you can talk about the basis of the lover's love for the beloved, right? Or of the subject's love for the object. The reasons for which the subject loves the object. Okay, so I'll give you a few more sample sentences to be sure that this is very clear for you. So again, if I say Rachel loves Ross, Rachel is the subject, Ross is the object. If I say Ross loves Rachel, now Ross is the subject and Rachel is the object. If I say Ross and Rachel love chocolate, Ross and Rachel are the subjects and chocolate is the object. If I say Ross and Rachel loves chocolate because it's sweet, Ross and Rachel are the subjects, the chocolate is the object, and the sweetness of the chocolate is the basis. Okay? If I say Ross and Rachel love each other, then each of them is both subject and object, right? Ross is the subject of his love and the object of Rachel's love, and Rachel is the subject of her love and the object of Ross's love. Now, here's a tricky one, actually. Imagine I say Ross loves Rachel's eyes. Now, here, Rachel's eyes are the objects of love, right? Stated like that, if I say Ross loves Rachel's eyes, what I'm saying is, Ross, there's a relationship of love, right? An instance of love. Ross is the one who experiences the love. He's the one who loves. And what he loves, the object of his love is, or are, Rachel's eyes, right? So in that case, Rachel's eyes are the object of love, or at least that's what's being claimed, right? Maybe that's incorrect. Maybe that's just a way of saying that what he loves is Rachel, but he loves her because of her eyes, whatever. But as stated, what that says is the object of Ross's love, the objects of Ross's love are Rachel's eyes. And now suppose I say, Ross loves Rachel's eyes because, I don't know, because of their color. Well, now the subject is Ross, Rachel's eyes are the object, and the color is the basis. Okay? So keep this schema in mind. It will come back literally, I think, every single lecture, right? The schema of the subject of love, the object of love, and the basis or bases, right? Basis if there's one basis, bases if there are several, of the love. Now, with this schema in mind, we can touch on a few of the questions that we can ask about love. Okay, so if we take it for granted that love always has this kind of form, right? That it is some kind of a relation or some kind of a relation between a subject and an object that usually has, but maybe doesn't necessarily have, some kind of basis. Now we can ask some questions about love. Okay, we can make it a bit clearer the kinds of questions we can ask. And here again, I'm drawing on the Sobel paper, right? Sobel goes through a bunch of different questions, and he doesn't always differentiate between which questions they are. So I'm going to do that a bit more clearly now, tease out a few questions that Sobel asks, make them clear. I won't touch on every question Sobel asks, and I think it'll be useful for you to go through the reading carefully and think about the ones that I'm not raising. But I'm going to raise a few that are going to be particularly important and that we're going to talk about over the next few weeks. So here then are some metaphysical questions. And so first, um, is love directed at a particular kind of object? So that relationship or that relation between a subject and an object that love is it necessarily, or is it always, is it by nature directed at a particular kind of object? Um, Specifically, or is it directed at a kind of object that is perceived to be good? Right? Is it always directed at an object that is perceived to be good? Let's think of an example here. Take the example of falling in love with someone, okay, or of being head over heels in love with someone. Many of us probably have had this experience. Some of us maybe not. But if you have had that experience, might you not say that, or wouldn't you say that it involves perceiving the object of your love as being good, right? When you're head over heels in love with someone, do you not perceive them to be good? Um, we could ask whether this is the case in other cases as well. When you love a sibling or a parent or a friend or even a movie or food, does that not involve seeing the thing that you love, seeing the object of your love as good? Arguably, it does, right? A lot of people have thought that. So that's one question that you can ask. Does it involve perceiving the object of love as good? Now, once you ask this question, you can ask a further question about the priority of these two things, about the love on the one hand and the perception of goodness on the other, right? If you've read the Sobel paper, he opens up by talking about this. Is it the case that in the experience of love, you love someone or something because you perceive it to be good? Or is it the case that you perceive it to be good because you love it? And notice, as Sobel points out, that this is related to a further question about whether love is rational, right? About the rationality or irrationality of love. So if I love someone because I perceive them to be good, so I perceive them to be noble or virtuous or just beautiful or witty or intelligent, whatever, right? These are all traits that are good. If I love someone because I perceive them to be good, and if I have very good evidence that they really are good, now it looks like my love is rational, right? My love is based on good reasons. I love them because I think they're good. And look, I have all this evidence to show that they really are good. But if, in contrast, I perceive them to be good because I love them, even though they might not actually be good, now it looks like my love is very irrational in two ways, right? On the one hand, it looks like the love itself is for no reason. I can't justify it. And what's even worse is it looks like it's given rise to some kind of an illusion, right? It's given rise to some kind of an illusion or delusion whereby I think that the object of my love is good, even though it isn't. Okay? So that's one set of metaphysical questions we can ask. First, is love always directed at an object that's perceived to be good? Second, what's the order of priority there, right? Does loving produce the perception, or does the perception produce the love? And third, very closely related, is love the kind of thing that's rational, or is it the kind of thing that's irrational? Okay, that's one set of questions about what love is and what it's like. Here's another metaphysical question. Is love directed at an object that's unique, or at an object that's irreplaceable? Again, that relationship or that relation in which a subject loves some object on the basis, usually, but not necessarily, of some traits. What exactly is the object and is it unique? So, for example, when you love someone, suppose we take our example from the last slide, where Rachel loves Ross because he's smart and funny and kind. Maybe we should say that she loves Ross because he has a particular kind of intelligence, right? Or he's smart in a particular way, or he has a particular kind of sense of humor. He's funny in a particular way, and so on and so forth. Okay, whatever you say there, is it not the case that you could find those same traits in another individual? And if so, then what exactly does it mean to say that the object of love is unique? Okay, so in the experience of love, so for example, again, the experience of falling in love or being head over heels in love with someone, you will often say things like, nobody gets the object of your love the way that you do, or nobody gets you the way that they do, right? That they get you, they understand how you're special or you're unique, and you understand how they're special and they're unique, or something like this, right? You might also, especially if you've just been broken up with, think that no one could ever replace them, right? They're unique, they're one of a kind. But we can ask, is that really true? Right? Is it really true that the object of your love is unique or irreplaceable or one of a kind? Because if love is based on a certain set of characteristics or traits or properties, well, characteristics or traits or properties can be found in other people. Right? And even if you want to say that your love is based on a particular combination of characteristics or traits or properties, um, now, it's true that it might be harder to find that exact combination, but there are like 8 billion people out there. And even if there are no real people with that exact combination, we can at least imagine that there could be others, right? And so, in a sense, the object of your love is not a unique individual. Um, they're a combination of properties or traits or characteristics that could be found in a number of people, right? So, if love is rational, and if it's based on certain kinds of properties that are perceived to be good, then it looks like, in a sense, the object of your love is not unique. The object of your love is the object of your love by virtue of properties that you could find in someone else. In contrast, if love is completely irrational and not based on any properties at all, now maybe the object of your love is unique in the sense that what you're attracted to is not a product of the person's properties that could be repeated in someone else. Okay. So there you have. And by the way, again, this is not restricted to just romantic love. You can raise the same kind of questions about the love you have for friends or for siblings, or the love that you have for ideals or movies or whatever, right? If my love for some movie is based on some traits of that movie, um, then there's an important sense in which the love is not, or the object of love is not unique. I would love any other movie with the same traits, or at least I could come to love another movie with the same kinds of traits. Okay, so that's another important metaphysical question. And you can see here, and Sobel does kind of gesture at this, that questions about love are often very closely related to questions about personal identity. Okay, so there's a metaphysical question here about the identity, the uniqueness of the object of love. Is love necessarily directed at an object that is unique? If so, what exactly does that mean? Um, and if not, then isn't it the case that there's a sense in which the object of love is replaceable, could be replaced with another? Okay. Um, that's again another set of questions, another cluster of questions about what love is and what it is like. Now, here's a third one. This is a pretty big one. Is love necessarily constant? Is it necessarily long lasting? Does it necessarily last forever? Um, let's again turn to the experience of falling in love or of being head over heels in love with someone. Now, when we're in that experience, when we're having that experience, um, usually we think, right, that our love will be constant. Okay? I don't think anybody has ever thought, I am head over heels in love with this person, but also I won't be in a couple days. Right? In the moment, we certainly think that our love will be constant, and we say so, right? I'll love you forever until death do us part, and so on and so forth. Okay. But set that aside. Set aside the fact that when we experience love, we usually think that it will last forever. One question we can ask is, if it really is love, must it last forever? Right? So I think there are a lot of people who will say things like, not philosophers necessarily, but just people who will say things like, well, if it's real love, it'll last forever. Or if your relationship ends, they might try to comfort you by saying, well, if it couldn't have been real love, it couldn't have been true love, because true love lasts forever. Okay, well, one question we can ask is that true? Right? Is it true that love necessarily lasts forever? Or is it possible for love to be shorter lived? Is it possible for love not to last forever? And again, we don't have to restrict ourselves to romantic relationships here. We can ask the same thing about our love for family, for friends, for ideals, for movies, or whatever, right? Um, A mother similarly will typically think that her love for her children will be constant. But suppose that one of the children does something terrible, maybe abusive or something like this, and she stops loving the child. Should we say that so it wasn't love in the first place? Or is it possible for it to have been love and then to have ended? Um, this, Sobel points out, is very closely related to the question about whether love is an emotional state or a volitional state. Okay, so whether it's emotional or volitional. Um, an emotion is a passion, right? It's something you experience passively that happens to you. A volition is an act of the will. It's something that you do uh, purposely, deliberately. So a lot of people have thought, as Sobel points out, that if love is an emotion, then it makes sense that love could be fleeting, right? That love could be short-lived. Why? Well, the reasoning is something like um, emotions are short-lived, emotions are fleeting, right? Emotions come and go. I can be sad in the morning and then happy in the evening. I can be scared in the more in the in I can be scared today and then at peace tomorrow, whatever. Emotions come and go. And so the reasoning is since emotions come and go, if love is an emotion, then love can also come and go. Love can be short-lived, right? Um, Whereas other people have thought that if love is a volition, if it's an act of the will, if to love someone is a decision, then it has a better chance of being constant, right? Then it makes sense to say that love can be constant because, so the argument goes, in an act of the will, in something that is done deliberately, there is more resolve, right? It doesn't come and go in the same way. But as Sobel points out, that may or may not be true. That doesn't really seem to be true because volitions come and go too. Acts of the will come and go. What I mean by that is we change our minds, right? Even if I make a deliberate decision, a conscious decision, I can always go back on my decision, and we do that all the time. And so um, Sobel thinks it's not very clear that if love's an emotion, it's going to be shorter lived than if it's a volition. But in any case, we can ask all these questions, right? We can ask questions about whether love is constant, whether it must be constant, and relatedly, whether it's emotional or volitional, whether it's an act of the will or whether it's a passion that we experience passively. This is, again, a metaphysical question about what love is, right? Is it an emotion? Is it a volition? And what it's like. Does it last forever or for a longer time, or can it last for a shorter time? Okay. So those are the metaphysical questions. Now, here are some ethical questions. And really, there's just one big ethical question, which is, are some kinds of love better than others? Or are some kinds of love more worth pursuing than others? Or are there some kinds of love that we should pursue over others, right? These are not all quite the same thing. Um, it may be the case that some kinds of love are better than others, even if there's none in particular that you should pursue, maybe. But all these questions are in the vicinity of each other, right? Are some kinds of love better or more worth pursuing, or are some kinds of love the ones that we should pursue, whereas others are worse, less worth pursuing, or ones that we maybe should not pursue, right? So here are some examples of this. So, for example, is love better when it's directed at an object that's genuinely good, right? So if we take it for granted that you can love something that isn't actually good, say because you perceive it to be good but incorrectly, would it be better if your love were directed at an object that really was good, right? So that's an ethical question about what's better or worse, right? What's good, bad, better, worse. Another question that we can ask is it better if love is more long-lasting? Or should we aim to make it more long-lasting by some kind of conscious effort? And so these are ethical questions about love. They're questions about what's good and bad, better, worse, right, wrong, what we should or should not aim at. And you'll see every one of the thinkers that we're going to discuss in this first unit, Plato, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, has an answer to every one of these metaphysical and ethical questions. Every one of them is going to have some account of what kind of an object love is directed at, whether love is directed at one that's perceived to be good or not, right? An object that's perceived to be good or not. Every one of them will have something to say about the uniqueness of the object of love, right? Whether the object of love is something unique, irreplaceable, unrepeatable, or whether it's something replaceable, repeatable, because it's loved in virtue of its traits. And then every single one of them will have something to say about whether love is longer lasting or shorter lasting. Moreover, all of them will have something to say about what kinds of love are better than others. When we read Plato, he's going to have something to say about this. When we read Aristotle, he's going to have something to say about this. And when we read Aquinas, he's also going to have something to say about this. So these are the metaphysical questions about the nature of love, about what it is, what it's like, and the ethical questions about what kinds of love are better or worse, more desirable, less desirable, that we're going to be looking at for the next, 8 or 9 lectures or so, for the next several weeks. Okay, so that's everything that I want to say about philosophy in general and the philosophy of love in particular. Okay, that's everything I want to say about what philosophy is, how we do it, and then the kinds of questions we ask in the philosophy of love. Now I want to move on in the time we have left to the history of the philosophy of love, because again, this is a history of philosophy class, and I think it'll be helpful before we get going to give you a little bit of historical context. And the first thing I want to do is give you kind of a timeline in which to situate the thinkers that we're going to be reading. So here is a timeline of Western history. Whenever you talk about Western history in like a history of science class or a history of philosophy class or a literature class or whatever, usually you'll divide history, Western history, into 3 periods. Okay, and I've got this graphic here, this illustration on the slide to indicate what those 3 periods are. First, there's antiquity, or the ancient period. Then there's the Middle Ages, or the medieval period, and modernity, or the modern period. Okay, and I've got some cutoff dates here. So usually antiquity, we think of as starting around 800 BC. This is what's called classical antiquity, until about 500 AD. And then the Middle Ages from about 500 AD to about 1500 AD. And then modernity from about 1500 AD to about, well, the present, right? So here I want to make a quick terminological point. When I talk about modern philosophy, and really when almost any philosophy professor talks about modern philosophy, or literature professor talks about modern literature, and so on and so forth, we're talking about the modern period. We're talking about philosophy or literature or science or history from 1500 AD onward, just about. Okay? In everyday life, people will use the word modern, literature, film, philosophy, to mean things that are happening now. That is not how I'm using the term, okay? Things that are happening now are part of the modern period, but the modern period stretches all the way back to about 1500 AD. Okay, so when I talk about things that are happening now, when I talk about philosophy that's being done now, I'll use the term contemporary, okay? The contemporary, like the co there is the same as in, community and co-worker, collaboration, and so on. The co there just means together, right? And the temporary, of course, means time. For things to be contemporary is for them to be together in time. Right? So when I say contemporary philosophy, I mean philosophy that's together in time with us. Okay, so when I'm talking about philosophy that's happening now, I'll call that contemporary philosophy. But whenever I say the words modern philosophy, I mean the philosophy of this period, going all the way back to 1500 AD. So if you know your history a bit, this is people like Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, René Descartes, Baruch Spinoza, Immanuel Kant, David Hume, and so on. 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century philosophers are all modern philosophers. Okay? Now, I'll just give you a little bit of historical background to get a sense of what's going on in these periods. I will give you a lot more background once we get there. But I said that antiquity we think of as ending around 500 AD. Now, in antiquity, the dominant powers were first ancient Greece and then ancient Rome. Okay, and the reason that 500 AD is thought of as the cutoff is that that's around the time of the fall of the Roman Empire. Okay, so that's when Rome ceases to be the dominant power in the Western world. Then, um, during the Middle Ages, the dominant power becomes, in some ways anyway, the Catholic Church. And so the Christian religion, the Catholic Church, has a lot of social power, a lot of political power during this period. And we think of the Middle Ages as ending around 1500 AD, in part because that's around the time that the power of the Catholic Church starts to dissolve. There are a number of reasons for this. On the one hand, there's the scientific revolution. We start to understand the world much better, and so gradually religion kind of loses its hold on the population. Um, but another really big, important thing that happened around the same time is what's called the Protestant Reformation. Okay, so at that point, Christianity or Western Christianity kind of splits in two. And so as a result, the Catholic Church loses a lot of its power. Okay. And then during the modern period, now you've got a much more secular society, a society in which religious belief, even though it still exists, has much less of a hand in our institutions. Okay, so this is kind of the big brushstrokes of what's going on. And given this division, you'll see that when you read ancient philosophers, there's kind of a background, you'll see this in Plato, of polytheism. Polytheism is just belief in multiple gods, right? So when you read Plato or Aristotle, they refer to the pantheon of Greek gods. Okay, when we read the Christian philosophers of the Middle Ages, well, there's a background of Christianity. The philosophers are all Christian. And then when you read philosophers in the modern period, they're much more secular. They're trying to philosophize without the assumptions of any particular religion. And we're going to see this in the figures that we read over the course of the semester. So in our first unit on the philosophy of love, we're going to be in antiquity and the Middle Ages. We're going to read Plato and Aristotle, both of whom wrote around 2,300 years ago, so around 300 BCE or so, 300 to 400 BCE. And then we're going to read Thomas Aquinas, who was writing during the Middle Ages around 1200 AD. And then our second unit on the philosophy of sex, we're going to continue with the Middle Ages, read some more Aquinas, and then move into modernity, where we're going to read John Stuart Mill, Immanuel Kant, and Michel Foucault. Okay, so that's where we're going. That's like the broad strokes of what's going on in the history. I'll give you much more details at the start of each topic, really. I'll give you some historical background each time. So now with the timeline out of the way, there's just one last thing I want to do, which is go over three different concepts of love that have been very important in the history of Western philosophy. You just can't do philosophy of love without distinguishing between three concepts of love. And those concepts are, as you can see on the slide here, eros, philia, and agape. These have been very important to not only the history of the philosophy of love, but they're very important to contemporary philosophy of love. Like when people write philosophy now and they do philosophy of love now, they still refer back to these concepts because they're so important. They've been so important to forming philosophical thought about love over the centuries. Now, Sobel talks about these in his paper, as I hope you know. But not only does he talk about it, but that paper, An Introduction to the Philosophy of Love, is from a book that he edited. And that book is titled, as you can see here, Eros, Agape, and Philia. Right? That's how important the concepts are. That this collection of essays by contemporary philosophers about the philosophy of love is titled Eros, Agape, and Philia, because the distinction between these different ways of thinking about love, or these different concepts of love, forms the background for all the discussions that are happening in the book. Okay, so you just can't do philosophy of love without knowing about these different concepts of love and the traditions that they're attached to. So first, eros. As I think you can probably tell, the ancient Greek term eros, is where our word erotic comes from. Okay, eros can be understood as romantic love, but actually, in some ways, it might be better translated as just attraction or desire. Okay, so when you talk about the love, when you talk about eros for another human being, typically it involves some kind of romantic or sexual attraction or romantic or sexual interest in someone. But um, in ancient Greek, the term eros really just means desire. Okay. And so you might think that love for things like chocolate, or for certain kinds of foods might be best understood as falling under the category of eros, right? It's a kind of attraction or desire to possess something, to have something. Um, so this concept of eros, we'll see when we read Plato. Plato thinks that uh, the kind of love you have, or the kind of romantic or sexual interest you have for someone, is best understood as a kind of eros, but also that your love for certain inanimate things might also best be understood as a kind of eros. It's kind of attraction, a kind of desire. Okay, so this is the concept of eros, and it's associated with I mean, the first instance you find in the philosophical tradition of it is in the writings of Plato, and that's what we're going to be starting the course with. Then the next concept is philia, right? Again, this is a Greek term, and you can probably tell that this is where several of our English words come from, right? So a cinephile, right? The term there is philia. A bibliophile, somebody who loves books, the term there is philia. Actually, this is the term that's in the word philosophy or philosopher. And as you'll see, Plato plays on this a lot, on the idea that philosophy is a kind of love. But the concept of philia is, you might translate it as friendly love, okay, the kind of love there is between friends. I've seen some people translate it as brotherly love, the kind of love there is between family. You could just translate it friendship, okay? So in some contexts, it's clear that the word means friendship, whereas in other contexts, it's more like the love that's involved in friendship. But in any case, it's the kind of loving bond that's associated with friends, with parents, with siblings, maybe with coworkers if you love your coworkers, right? Here, this isn't the same kind of thing. Eros involves some kind of attraction or desire, right? The desire to have something or someone. Philia isn't like that. You might describe philia more as a bond of well-wishing, right, or of goodwill. When you're friends with someone, you love them, but you want what's best for them. You do things for them, that kind of thing. Generally, you aren't attracted to them or don't desire them. Or if you do, that's over and above the friendship, right? You can have eros and philia for the same object. In that case, you have a kind of a bond of friendship with them, but also you desire them romantically or sexually. Okay, so that's a different concept there of love. And this, we find kind of the most famous statement of it in the works of Aristotle, okay, which is why, after talking about Plato, we're going to move on to Aristotle and talk about philia. And then finally, the third concept is the concept of agape, which is often translated as neighbor love. It's actually hard to find a good translation of this, but it's supposed to be a kind of universal or unconditional love that we have for all human beings. Now, you might think you don't recognize this word, right? You recognize eros because it's in our word erotic. You recognize philia because it's in our words like cinephile and bibliophile. But we don't see the word agape anywhere. Well, you're right. What we do see, though, is its Latin translation. Because remember, agape is an ancient Greek word, but agape is most closely associated with the Christian tradition. And during the Middle Ages, when a lot of Christian philosophy was happening, everybody spoke Latin. Okay? And the Latin translation of agape is caritas, which you see in the English word charity. Right? When you give out of charity, or if you have the virtue of charity, what that originally, or what that refers to, is the virtue of universal love for humankind, right? The virtue of caritas or agape. This comes from the Christian tradition, as I said. In the Christian tradition, agape is both the love that we are supposed to have for God and the love that God has for us. And there's supposed to be some relation between, on the one hand, loving God, and on the other hand, loving all human beings whom God loves. Okay. Here, again, the main place you find the most important text where this is laid out is in Christian texts. And specifically, we're going to be reading Thomas Aquinas, but of course, you find it in all kinds of other texts going back to the ancient period. Okay, so those are the three big concepts of love. Remember, earlier I said in everyday life, we might say that we love all kinds of different things. You might say that you love your spouse or your girlfriend or boyfriend. You might say that you love your friends or your mother or your siblings or your coworkers. You might say that you love all of humanity. You might say that you love chocolate or movies or whatever. Um, there are several different kinds of love, it seems, and you can more or less map them onto this, right? So the love you have for your spouse, that can be attraction that you have for a spouse or a girlfriend or a boyfriend, that's eros. Maybe the kind of love that you have for certain kinds of inanimate things like foods also should be understood as eros. But the kind of bond that you have with a parent or a friend, well, that's philia. And then, if you do love all of humanity, if you have a kind of impartial, unconditional love for all persons, well, that's agape. Okay. Um, so we have these different concepts of love. But now we can ask some questions about these, which Sobel also raises, by the way. One question is a metaphysical one. Are these all different things? Are they all very different kinds of things? And if so, why do we call them all love? Right? In everyday life, we would call all these things love, or we could call all these things love. So are they completely different things? And if so, well, why do we call them all love? Um, or are they instead varieties of one thing? Right? Are they all just varieties of love, just slightly different from each other? And if they are all varieties of love, well, what makes them all instances of one and the same thing? Right? What are the characteristics that are common to all these different kinds of love that make them all love? Right? So that's a metaphysical question that is worth asking. When we say that we love all these different things, spouses, family, humanity, ideals, countries, movies, whatever, do we always mean love in exactly the same way? Or at least, um, are the things that we're talking about close enough that we can understand them all as kinds of the same thing? They're all kinds of love. And if so, what is it that makes them all different kinds of one and the same thing? What is it that makes them all love? Right? Um, to this, we can add an ethical question. If we grant that there are different kinds of things here, even if they're different varieties of the same thing, we can ask, are some of them better than others? Right? Are some of them more important than others, or more crucial to human development, or more fulfilling than others? Right? Are some of them more worthy of our pursuit, more important to our everyday lives, or to our development, or something like this? That's an ethical question. Right? We can ask, is philia more important or better, more noble than eros? Is agape more important or better or more noble than eros or philia? Not only that, but if there are different kinds of eros, different kinds of philia, different kinds of agape, we can ask, is one kind of eros better than others? Is one kind of philia better or more important than others? Is one kind of agape better or more important than others? Okay, so these are some ethical questions. And again, the thinkers that we're going to be reading in this first unit, Plato, Aristotle, and Thomas Aquinas, have answers, or propose answers, I should say. They think they have answers to these questions, okay, about which ones of these loves, or which kinds of each kind of love, is more important or better than the others. Okay, so that's everything that I wanted to say now about the history of the philosophy of love and about the concepts that we're going to be using from that history to talk about love. So here is a quick summary, a quick recap of what we've talked about today. First, what I'd like you to know and to remember is that the philosophy of love addresses some metaphysical questions. Okay? It addresses questions about what love is and what love is like. So for example, is it an emotion or a volition? Does it involve the perception of value? If so, is the perception of value the cause of the love, or is the love the cause of the perception of value, and so on and so forth? The philosophy of love also addresses ethical questions. It addresses questions about what kinds of love are better or worse, more worth pursuing, less worth pursuing, should be or ought to be sought out or ought not to be sought out, and so on and so forth. So, for example, we can ask whether love should be longer lasting, or whether it's better when it is longer lasting, and so on and so forth. And then finally, the last thing I want you to remember is that when discussing these kinds of questions, metaphysical and ethical, it's often helpful to distinguish between different conceptions of love. Okay? Eros, philia, and agape. And to ask, are these the same kinds of things, right? Do these share all those kinds of properties that we say love has? And are they all equally good? Right? So this helps us to frame our questions about the metaphysics of love, what it is, and the ethics of love, which kinds are better or worse. Okay, so that's it. That's everything I wanted to say. Next time, we're going to begin talking about the first topic, which is going to be about eros, and specifically one conception of eros as a desire for union with the beloved or union with the object of love. In preparation for that, please make sure to read Plato, the first excerpt from Plato, which is called Aristophanes' Speech, for next time. And please make sure also to do the practice quiz for this lecture so you can test your knowledge. Okay, thanks very much and see you next time. Bye.